Well, welcome back everyone to the myCOW podcast. Thanks for joining us for the next iteration of using Springer cow data to unlock farm performance. Before we get into the next one, I want to talk a little bit about what's been happening with the app. We've been working really hard in the background to get those last integrations over the line, and now we are getting pretty close to having a commercial product, so we'll keep you updated on progress there. But yeah, if you haven't already, jump onto our website and sign up to the newsletter, and that'll keep you updated with what's happening with the app, but also when the new podcast episodes come out. Now, as always, what we do on the podcast is not specific advice. It's information to get you thinking, get you asking questions of your real professionals, nutritionists, vets, and other people that you work with around how we can fine-tune things to get a better result on farm. Right, now into today's episode. Today we're going to talk about blood test data and how we used blood test data to make better decisions that unlock performance in our herd. There's three key things we're going to cover today. We're going to look at how and when we collect blood from our springers, colostrums, and milkers. We're going to talk about the specific data that we're looking at in those bloods. And then lastly, we're going to finish up with how we use that data to make better decisions to improve performance on farm. But before we get into this content, here's a quick word from our key sponsor, Agvance.
Hi, I'm Jason from Agvance Nutrition. A solid transition plan is crucial to start your cows off on the right foot and set your season up for success. The impact of feeding a balanced diet with the correct mineral supplementation cannot be underestimated. We've developed Premium Transition Premix to ensure we give the right mineral supplementation to your Springer cows at the right time. So get in touch with us on the 0800 number or via our website, and we'll be happy to get you sorted.
So when do we collect bloods from our springers, colostrums, and milkers? So ideally we do that at the second week of calving, and then again 6 weeks into calving. If you haven't typically had a lot of issues and you just want to do some check bloods to see how things are going, you could do just one set of bloods at about 4 weeks. But if you're really trying to drive performance forward, and you have had a few niggly issues in the past, like too much condition loss post-calving, poor cow recovery post-calving, those sort of things, then I recommend getting a set of bloods at around that 2 weeks into calving, and again at that 6 week interval into calving. Right, so who are we collecting blood from? We want to collect bloods from around 6 to 8 Springer cows. So these are cows that are within 6 days of calving, ideally. Doesn't have to be, but if they're in that window, that gives you a really good idea of what's happening, particularly in the liver of the cow. Now, the second group are the colostrums. So these are the cows that are less than 4 days calved. So what's happening with calcium, phosphorus, NEFAs, and BHBs in those cows is really important. And the last group are the milkers, and so we want around 10 of the milkers ideally, because there's generally a bit of a range. But if you can target milkers at around that 6 to 12 days calved, that is an ideal window. Sometimes we might grab 3 or 4 that are about 6 to 8 days calved, and then you might grab another handful that are around that 12 days, and another handful that are more like 20 days. Especially if you have seen quite a bit of condition loss in those cows, then it might be worth getting some check bloods in the cows that are a little bit further down the road. But generally, if you bleed those milkers at around that 6 to 12 days post-calving is the ideal window. Now, we want a mixture of ages. So obviously in the first 2 weeks, you're probably going to get a few more heifers because there's going to be more heifers in the milkers. But if we can get a mixture of ages, that is ideal. Now, farmers, you can collect bloods yourselves. A lot of vets actually store blood testing packs, so they'll have tubes, needles, and holders, so they'll allow you to draw blood yourself, and then you can drop those tubes into the vet clinic to get tested. Now, collecting the cow number is really important because we can link that back to the age, but we can also link it back to rumination and other cow wearable data, as well as body condition scoring, cameras, walkover weighing, that sort of thing. So if you write down the numbers on the tube and you can see a pattern of what's happening with that cow in the blood, then we can link that back to some of that cow behavior information as well. The next thing I want to talk about is what we're testing for and why. So what we're testing for fits into 3 main categories: minerals, liver and cow condition, and lastly oxidative capacity and inflammation. The first mineral we're going to look at is calcium. Now there's 1.2 grams of calcium per litre of milk, so there's a large amount of calcium flowing out of the cow. So we need to make sure that she is in the right balance so that she can maintain those blood calcium levels by mobilizing calcium from the bone, but also absorbing calcium from the diet. Now, calcium gives us an indication of how well the cow is metabolically balanced, which we're going to talk more about later in the podcast. Also gives us an idea of what's happening with smooth muscle function in the cow, most notably rumination. So if calcium levels are low, that's going to have a direct impact on smooth muscle function, and that is going to upset our rumen recovery or our rumination rates. The other thing smooth muscle does is it tightens up the teat sphincter. So if you have a lack of calcium, then that opens that cow up to increase risk of mastitis. And lastly, calcium is really important in immune function. So it has a bit of a double whammy effect when it comes to things like mastitis because of that teat end closure and also immune system function. And so that also flows into other areas linked to inflammation, things we'll talk about later in the podcast. Magnesium is the second mineral. Now, magnesium is really important for nerve function and muscle function, but it also helps to maintain calcium balance and parathyroid hormone action. The third mineral we want to look at is phosphorus. So there's a gram of phosphorus per litre of milk. And so as milk production goes up rapidly post-calving, so does phosphorus demand. Now, phosphorus is really important for energy metabolism. It converts ATP into ADP. So it's very important for fueling cells and fueling the cow. Now, phosphorus and calcium, they together build bone matrix. So if we have a lack of phosphorus, we're going to have a lack of bone density. Phosphorus is also very important for cell membrane and structure, important for fiber digestion in the rumen, and low levels can also impair cow recovery because phosphorus is really important for appetite, and because of that, it will drive milk production in the cow. Now, the second category is liver and cow condition. So I put liver and cow condition together because there's two key factors here. We're looking at non-esterified fatty acids and beta-hydroxybutyrate. Now, both of these blood measures give us a bit of an idea of what's happening in the liver, which directly relates to cow condition. So NEFA stands for non-esterified fatty acids, and it is a great measure of the amount of fat that the cow is mobilizing. When a cow calves, she can't eat enough to maintain her energy, protein, and mineral nutrition requirements. And so that's why the cow mobilizes stores to meet those requirements. Now, one of the biggest stores is fat stored for energy. So NEFA tells us how much fat the cow is mobilizing. On the other hand, beta-hydroxybutyrate, sometimes written as BOHB or BHB, is a measurement of how well the liver is dealing with or metabolizing that fat. So what happens is NEFA is mobilized from stored fat tissue. It then goes to the liver, and the liver metabolizes that fat and releases it as energy or glucose. But if that process is not done efficiently, one of the byproducts of inefficient fat metabolism is the production of ketone bodies. Now, that is, I know, a gross oversimplification, but for time's sake and what we're doing today, it's probably the best way for me to describe it. I have done a whole podcast on ketosis, which you're welcome to go back and have a look at, which will explain that process in a lot more detail. But basically, if the liver is not healthy, not functioning well, or it's a bit overloaded with fat, we're going to have a higher production of ketone bodies, and that's measured as beta-hydroxybutyrate in the blood. So when we're looking at liver and cow condition, we're looking at both NEFAs and BOHBs in combination. So what we're doing is we're looking at NEFAs for how much weight the cow is losing, and that's important at each of the different stages. Our springers, we don't want them losing too much weight or any weight really pre-calving. Our colostrum cows are going to lose a bit of weight, but we don't want them losing it too quickly. And our milking cows, we want to try and minimize the amount of weight that those milking cows lose. Now, the tricky thing with ketone bodies in the blood, or BHB levels, is that a small amount of ketone is actually quite useful. It fuels the brain with energy. and it also supplies the cells with energy. But where it becomes a problem is where those ketone bodies get too high in the blood, because they're very toxic and they can actually trigger metabolic disease in the cow. And this is why we look at NEFA, which gives us an idea of how much weight the cow is losing, alongside the BHB or the BOHB levels in the blood, which tells us how well the liver is dealing with that mobilized fat. Now, the third category is oxidative capacity and inflammation. Now, the science is still developing in the space around pasture-fed cows, but the science coming from TMR cows in the US and Europe is really exciting. It's indicating that there is a lot we have to gain by learning more about oxidative capacity and inflammation and what's going on in the cows. So what do these things measure? Oxidative capacity is the capacity that the cow has to push against free radicals, generally caused by stress. So stress from hunger, stress from the environment or climate, driving rain, cold rain, wind, and also toxins in the feed cause oxidative damage in the cow via free radicals. So oxidative capacity is how well the cow can deal with those. And so we can measure that a whole lot of different ways. We can look at the level of vitamin E in the cow. Vitamin E is a very important tool to fight against oxidative damage. GPX or glutathione peroxidase is another good measurement. It is linked to selenium, so you can actually measure GPX to get a good gauge of how much selenium is stored in the cow. Selenium doesn't generally store, but it'll sit in the GPX for around 30 days. Inflammation is measured by haptoglobin or globulin levels in the blood, although haptoglobin is a much more distinct measure, whereas globulin is a combination of a whole lot of different proteins in the blood, so it's not very specific. So GPX, vitamin E, and haptoglobin levels in the blood can be really useful for looking at both oxidative capacity and inflammation. Now, there are a whole lot of other blood tests that are available as well. Sky's the limit. It really comes down to your budget and what you're looking at. Really, the key ones are looking at your calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, your NEFAs, and your BHB levels or beta-hydroxybutaраtes. Outside of that, you're really looking at specific things in the cow. If you've seen negative effects around oxidative damage or inflammation that you want to look further into, that's when these other measurements can be really useful. Research is developing more in using bilirubin as an indicator of liver dysfunction in the cows. And we can also look at glucose levels in the blood. If glucose levels are low, that's telling us that gluconeogenesis is not functioning well in the cow, so the liver is not producing glucose very efficiently. We can look at cholesterol. Cholesterol gives us an idea of appetite, but will also drop if the cows are under inflammatory stress. Albumin is a specific protein that reflects how well the liver is synthesizing and releasing amino acids into the cow, or true complex protein. And I already talked about haptoglobin as a marker for inflammation, and lastly vitamin E as an oxidative capacity measure. So there's lots we can look at in the blood, and we can get a little bit carried away, but it's really getting that base level of knowledge around minerals and what's happening in the liver and cow condition, and then from there targeting specific issues that you need to, or you feel like you need to address in the cow. So for more information around what you can do with blood tests and those specific issues, if you talk to your nutritionist or your vet, and they'll be able to give you more specific information for your farm. All right, now we get to the point again. So what are we actually doing with this data to improve performance in the cows? So I'm going to go through the levels that we want to be aiming for in each of the different blood parameters and also the cow class. So first is calcium. So with springers, we want to be seeing above 2.2 micromole in the blood, as we do with milkers. And so if the springers are below this level, then that indicates that we have a few different things potentially going on in the cow. First thing is the DCAD may be out of balance. And so if the DCAD is out of balance, so we have, say, too much pasture in the diet, too high potassium levels, and we can't get the DCAD down low enough, that's going to upset the cow's sensitivity or metabolic processes around the parathyroid hormone, vitamin D, and that release of calcium from the bone. So balancing the DCAD is the first thing we look at there. The next thing is we want to make sure we are supplying enough calcium alongside a negative or a balanced DCAD. If we're not supplying enough calcium, we're relying wholly on the cow's ability to absorb calcium from the diet and also mobilize calcium from the bone. And sometimes those two factors, what's in the diet and what's in the bone, is actually not sufficient. So having extra supplemented calcium is really important. But what's key there is giving calcium in the right form. So we want to make sure we use a negative DCAD or a calcium source that doesn't impact the DCAD in a positive way. So it doesn't lift the DCAD, it keeps the DCAD down. So calcium sulfate, gypsum, a really good source. A calcium chloride can be used as well. And lastly, we use our calcium-based buffers that are safe to use and don't upset the DCAD. All right, moving on to colostrums. So colostrums, we want to be between 1.8 and 2.2 micromole. They can be higher, that's fine, but it's okay if they dip into a lower level of calcium. Now, Clara Seeley did some amazing work back in 22 where she looked at different blood levels or different profiles of calcium in the blood from springers, colostrums, right through to milkers. And she found that milkers that took a short, sharp dip in calcium but came back up to over 2.2 micromole within 4 days post-calving actually had a better outcome in terms of milk production. Now, the better outcome wasn't necessarily related to the drop in calcium. It was probably more related to higher performance cows, but it just showed that a short drop in calcium actually didn't have a negative impact on the cow. But if we have cows coming back under 1.8 micromole per litre, then that is a potential issue in the transition mix. So generally in that situation, if we're only seeing a few low calciums in the colostrums and we're not seeing any metabolic disease, then both the springers and the milkers are testing really well for calcium. I don't get too worried about it. We just let it be, and we let everything carry on going as it should. If the cows are not recovering well, so that we're not getting adequate rumination minutes post-calving, we are seeing immune system dysfunction and other metabolic related issues, that's when we'll look a bit closer at calcium and maybe increase the supply of calcium to the springers, colostrums, and potentially milkers as well. Now onto the milkers, again we want them above 2.2 micromole per litre, and any calcium deficiency in the milkers needs to be addressed in their supplement. So either supplements through the shed, through the wagon or silage on the feed pad, or simply dusted on the pasture. All right, on to magnesium. So with magnesium, we want our springers and our milkers between that 0.85 and 0.95 millimolar per litre. Now I know that's a pretty tight range and it's a little bit lower than what you'll see in the general reference range. But I like that range nice and tight enough because we don't want magnesium too low because it's really important for calcium and phosphorus metabolism in the cow. But we also don't want magnesium too high in either the springers or the milkers because those are the areas where the magnesium will have a negative impact if it's above 0.95 on calcium and phosphorus availability in the cow. Now with the colostrums, it's a little bit different. The colostrums have a metabolic function where they get a spike in magnesium, and so sometimes we'll see 1.1s, 1.15 in the colostrum, and that's okay as long as that doesn't stay for too long. As long as both the springers and the milkers are within the required range, then that is no problem. So if magnesium levels are low, then obviously we want to increase the magnesium supplement to all classes of animal. So with the springers, generally we're either putting increased mag oxide in the springer mix or we're putting some magnesium chloride, magnesium sulfate into the mix to boost that magnesium up. If the colostrums are low, then we really want to have a look at what's happening in the springer mix. But also what we're dusting on the pasture for the colostrums. And then the milkers, if they're low, then we just want to increase our standard magnesium supplement. So pretty straightforward. Likewise, if magnesium is high, we need to bring magnesium supplement down right across each of the three groups. Right, the last mineral category is phosphorus. So phosphorus is a tricky mineral because I said to a farmer today, it's a bit of a hidden villain. It doesn't always rear its ugly head, but when it does, it's pretty nasty. So if you've ever seen crawler cows, they can be pretty tough to deal with, and unfortunately a lot more likely to die of metabolic disease than what standard hypercalcemia type cows will. And so we really want to keep a pretty close eye on phosphorus. The tricky thing with phosphorus is it plays either really nicely or not nicely with calcium. And so I say that because sometimes we can have adequate calcium levels in the blood, but we can have poor phosphorus. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. And I'm not going to go into each of them today because I'm actually going to do another whole podcast on phosphorus because there's some amazing research around phosphorus homeostasis and how that works in the cow. But I'm going to just talk about blood and what we are doing with phosphorus alongside calcium. So with springers, we want above 1.4 micromole per litre. Now, there's quite a range in phosphorus. The phosphorus levels can be around that 1.2 and go right up to sort of 2.4 or even 2.8. So there's quite a range. And the tricky thing with phosphorus is the blood really doesn't give us much of an idea of what's actually stored in the bone. So we're really just looking at what phosphorus is there at that stage. Now, colostrums, we also want to be aiming for that above 1.4 micromole per litre. Once the cows get around that 1.2, that's when they become sensitive to phosphorus deficiency and going down as a crawler or a creeper cow. Lastly, with the milkers, we want to be aiming a little bit higher. We want to be above 1.8 micromole per litre, and the reason for that is phosphorus is really important for driving appetite, really important for cow recovery, and obviously important for milk production. So we want that higher level of phosphorus in our milkers. Now, I talked a little bit about phosphorus and calcium. Now, the tricky thing with phosphorus is it doesn't strictly work on the same parathyroid hormone mechanism as what calcium does. So if blood calcium and phosphorus drop, parathyroid hormone is released. That stimulates the release of vitamin D, which stimulates the whole calcium homeostatic process. So what that does is it saves or spares calcium being stripped out of the body, recirculates it, and helps release calcium from the bone, which brings those blood levels up in the cow. Now, with phosphorus, some of those processes operate. So the recycling of phosphorus operates. But with the presence of parathyroid, it actually upregulates the excretion of phosphorus from the renal system or through the urine. So if we're doing a really good job of the transition by getting the DCAD in really good balance and we're achieving really good calcium levels, sometimes that can actually upregulate the amount of phosphorus that's been excreted by the cow. So we need to be really mindful of what's happening with phosphorus alongside calcium and making sure that we're supplementing phosphorus at key times, but at the right amount. And again, for specific advice, talk to your vet, your nutritionist for help in this space specific to what your cows and your farm need. If you're a reader and you want any of the research references that I've used for calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus in this podcast, please send me a message. I'm more than happy to pull those references together for you and send them through. Jesse Goff and Jim Drackley and a whole lot of others have done some fantastic work in this space. So yeah, if you're a reader and you want to learn more, please let me know and I'm happy to fire them through to you. Right, on to NEFA or non-esterified fatty acids. So in the springers, we want to be below 0.4 micromole per litre in the blood. That basically tells us that the cows are not losing too much condition pre-calving, which is really important. If we're above 0.4 micromole per litre, that indicates that potentially the cows are being underfed, or the diet balance is not right and the liver's struggling, and so those cows are lacking in glucose and the cow's starting to mobilize condition ahead of when she should. One of the key things to look at if NEFA levels are too high in the springers is, are those cows that are very close to calving standing back off the feed? You know, if they're a day or two out from calving and standing back and not competing with the rest of the cows at the feed face, then that's telling you that there's an imbalance in the diet and there's something not right with the liver of those cows, which is upsetting their metabolic balance. Now, with the colostrums, we want to be between 0.4 and 0.7 millimole per litre. Now, that is a satisfactory amount of weight loss. So remember, when the cows calve, they can't eat enough to meet their energy requirements, so they have to mobilize some fat to make up for that. So the cows are always going to be higher NEFA levels in the blood in the colostrums, but we don't want them to be too high. If they're pushing 1.2 or even 1.6 millimole per litre, that is a large amount of condition those cows are mobilizing, and it's putting a lot of pressure on the liver. And also it costs 2 parts of energy for every part that's lost to put that fat back into the cow. And so it is a big cost if the cows lose too much condition. So if we can minimize condition loss post-calving, essentially that's money in the bank. It helps the cows ride out any bumps through lactation of bad weather or feed shortages or pinches or whatever. And it means that that's less condition we have to put back on those cows in the autumn. Now, lastly, the milkers. We want to see the milkers less than 0.6 millimole per litre. So still a little bit more than the springers, and it's okay for the milkers to be losing some condition, but we don't want them to be losing too much condition. So around that 0.6 millimolar or below is ideal. Now moving on to BHB or beta hydroxybutyrates in the blood. It's actually the same level in the springers as it is the NEFAs. So we do not want to see beta hydroxybutyrates above 0.4 millimole per litre in the springers. If those levels are high, that's indicating that those livers are under a certain amount of stress and that the cow is losing condition. So it's a double whammy and really not a good place you want to be. You do not want those cows under inflammatory pressure before they even calve. And so this is why getting those blood tests is really useful, because it will help you identify if there are any issues and you can get in there and take action quickly. Now with colostrums, we don't want the beta hydroxybutyrates too high, but we will allow them up to about 0.6 millimole per litre. So you're always going to get a small amount of ketone released. And like I said earlier, a small amount of ketone in the blood is fine. It actually provides a really efficient fuel for the cow. But if it gets too high, it becomes a big problem. If the beta hydroxybutyrate levels are getting too high in the colostrums, it's going to have quite a few negative impacts on the appetite of the cow, and it's also going to impact cow recovery. So we want to try and get on top of that as quickly as possible. So ways of getting on top of high beta hydroxybutyrates is we can help support the liver. So we can help support the liver with rumen-protected methyl donors like choline and betaine. We can also help increase the liver's supply of energy. So soluble sugars can be quite useful. Putting monensin into the springer mix and also the early lactation blend can be useful at increasing the amount of glucose or propionic acid that the liver has access to. So those little tools can help sort of fine tune or help support the liver through that period and help bring those beta hydroxybutyrate levels down. Because if we're getting into subclinical ketosis, that's definitely costing us cow performance. If we get into clinical ketosis, it's going to upset metabolic balance, and that's going to have a whole lot of negative flow-on effects in terms of cow performance and reproductive performance as well. So it's the same story with the milkers. We don't want to see them above 0.6 millimole per litre. Now it is quite common in New Zealand to see cows around that 0.8 and right up to 1.2. But it's not necessary. We can work the diet really carefully, supply the right nutrients at the right balance to keep those beta hydroxybutyrate levels down, because if we can reduce the pressure on the liver, we can improve the cow's ability to convert feed into milk. We can reduce the condition loss that she suffers post-calving. We can improve appetite and recovery post-calving. All of those things flow into better milk production and better repro as well. All right, to finish off, I'm going to go through some of the extra blood measurement parameters quickly. So the first one is haptoglobin. Haptoglobin, I think, has some great merit, and it's something that I want to start testing a lot more in New Zealand to see how it correlates back to cow performance. So with haptoglobin, we are ideally looking for less than 0.2 grams of haptoglobin per litre in the blood, but it commonly sits around that, or just under 0.5 grams per litre. And so again, haptoglobin is linked to inflammation in the cow. Lance Baumgart's done a lot of work around inflammation, and other researchers are doing a lot of work as well. And they're tying back inflammation back to metabolic balance and cow recovery post-calving. So it is something that the researchers are encouraging us to look at more closely in our cows. Now, albumin, as I said before, is linked to protein supply, and protein is really important for utilizing mobilized fat efficiently and really driving appetite and cow performance, and especially in early lactation. So we want albumin levels to sit around that 25 to 38 grams per litre in the blood. Now, the next one that I talked about is cholesterol. Now, cholesterol, we want that level sitting around 1.3 to 3 micromole per litre. And again, the cholesterol is a measurement of energy supply. So if the liver is not happy and it's not functioning well, we're going to see a drop in albumin levels, protein supply to the cow, and also a drop in cholesterol level, which is indicating that there is a drop of energy supply to the cow. And then finally, GPX and vitamin E. So GPX, glutathione peroxidase, we want sitting between 150 and 300. Again, GPX is linked to selenium supply. So if GPX is low, then increasing the supply of selenium to the cow will definitely help. And vitamin E, we want vitamin E levels above 3 microgram per mil. Although if you're giving a reasonable amount of pasture to the cows, often vitamin E levels will be pretty good. But if you're feeding predominantly silages, vitamins get degraded through the silaging process. So having some extra vitamin E in the diet could really help. And again, GPX and vitamin E are linked to oxidative capacity. So cows are going through a lot of inflammation, a lot of stress over that calving period. So giving the cow the right tools to fight against the oxidative stress is really important in protecting her reproductive system in particular, and helping to minimize the effects on lameness and other animal health factors. So to sum up, there is a lot we can look at in the blood of our cows, and that data is super valuable. Knowing what's happening in our springers, colostrums, and milkers, it gives us the visibility to make really good decisions. So the decisions around calcium, magnesium, phosphorus balance, making sure we've got the transition, the DCAD, and the right diet balance all tuned finely in the cow, making sure our colostrums are happy, not under too much stress, recovering really well, and then going on to be milkers that produce to their full potential, and have minimal animal health effects. So I hope you enjoyed all the detail today. Sorry if it was a little bit detail heavy, but yeah, I enjoyed pulling all this together, and I look forward to seeing you in the next podcast episode where we dig into the next topic around using Springer data to unlock performance in our cows. Thanks again for jumping on, and we'll see you next time.